The Cold War did not look like war. That is perhaps the most dangerous thing about it. There were no large-scale land invasions between the principal powers, no declared hostilities, no formal exchange of fire across a recognized front. What there was instead was something harder to name and harder to see. A decades-long condition of armed expectation in which two civilizations built systems designed to destroy each other and then sat inside those systems, waiting. The waiting itself became a kind of infrastructure. It required facilities, personnel, protocols, and eventually entire underground cities devoted to the singular purpose of remaining ready to end the world at a moment's notice. Most people, when they think about the Cold War, imagine the surface of it. They think about speeches, summits, Berlin, Cuba, Korea, Vietnam. They think about the public theater of superpower rivalry, the press conferences, the parades of missiles through Red Square, the congressional hearings, the spy films. What they do not think about, because they were never meant to think about it, is what lay beneath. What lay beneath was in many respects the real Cold War. It was a network of bunkers, tunnels, command centers, missile silos, submarine pens, communications relays, and continuity of government facilities that stretched across 2 continents and extended in some cases hundreds of feet into the earth. These structures were not built for show. They were built for use. And the fact that they were never used in the way they were designed to be used is not a testament to wisdom or restraint. It is, in the most literal sense of the word, a coincidence. This is the story of 24 of those underground systems. It is not a comprehensive catalog, because no comprehensive catalog exists in the public domain. Many of the facilities discussed here were classified for decades. Some remain partially classified today. The details that are known come from declassified documents, facility tours conducted after the Cold War ended, investigative journalism, and the accounts of people who worked inside these systems and in some cases nearly watched them activate. The story begins, as most Cold War stories do, with fear, but not the fear of any single event. It begins with the institutional recognition, arrived at independently by both the United States and the Soviet Union sometime in the late 1940s, that the development of nuclear weapons had fundamentally altered the relationship between government and survival. Prior to the nuclear era, a government could be destroyed and reconstituted. A city could be leveled and rebuilt. A population could be decimated and would eventually recover. Nuclear weapons changed the calculus. The destruction they promised was not proportional. It was not tactical. It was at the strategic scale at which the superpowers were planning, potentially civilizational. And the people responsible for managing that threat responded in the only way that large bureaucracies know how to respond to existential problems. They built things. The first serious American effort to protect the command and control infrastructure of the federal government from nuclear attack was not particularly sophisticated. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the primary concern was continuity, ensuring that if Washington were struck, there would be someone, somewhere, with the legal authority and the communications capability to direct whatever response was still possible. The initial solutions were modest: pre-designated alternate sites, arrangements for the dispersion of key personnel, and the beginnings of a hardened communications network. But as the Soviet nuclear arsenal grew, and as the estimated destructive radius of available weapons expanded, the initial solutions became obviously inadequate. What was required was not improvised dispersal, but purpose-built survival. The Raven Rock Mountain Complex, officially designated Site R, sits inside a Pennsylvania mountain roughly 6 miles from Camp David. Construction began in 1950, and the facility became operational in 1953. It was designed to serve as an alternate Pentagon, a hardened command node capable of directing military operations even if Washington had been destroyed. The complex is built on enormous steel springs, an engineering decision made to absorb the shock of nearby nuclear detonations. The springs were not a gesture toward optimism. The planners who specified them understood that the shock absorption was necessary precisely because they expected the facility to survive impacts close enough to cause structural damage. Inside, the complex contains multiple buildings, each independent of the others, each capable of functioning as a self-contained operation center. It has its own power generation, its own water supply, its own air filtration systems. It was designed to sustain a population of several thousand for an extended period without any external resupply. Raven Rock has been continuously operational since the 1950s. It was not built as a historical artifact. It was built as a working facility, and it remains one. The existence of Raven Rock was not publicly confirmed by the United States government for decades. This was not an accident of bureaucratic inattention. It was a deliberate policy decision rooted in the logic of deterrence. If the Soviets knew exactly where American command and control was located, those locations became priority targets. If they could not be certain, the uncertainty itself was a form of protection. The secrecy that surrounded Cold War underground facilities was therefore not merely institutional reflex. It was a calculated element of the deterrence strategy. The underground world was meant to be invisible, and for a long time it largely was. Mount Weather, formerly known as the Special Facility, sits inside a Virginia mountain roughly 48 miles west of Washington. It is operated by what is now the Federal Emergency Management Agency, though during the Cold War it was managed by the Office of Emergency Planning and its successors. The facility was designed not just as a military command center, but as a complete alternate seat of government, a place where the constitutional line of succession could be maintained, and the functions of the executive branch could continue after a nuclear strike. Inside Mount Weather there were offices for the president and the cabinet, dormitories for hundreds of personnel, a hospital, a crematorium, a television studio, and a complete system for broadcasting presidential addresses to whatever audience might remain. The crematorium was not a minor detail. It was a recognition that people would die inside the facility and that their remains would need to be managed without compromising the facility's sealed environment. The television studio was equally telling. Even in the aftermath of a nuclear exchange, the planners believed that the appearance of presidential authority, the image of a functioning government, would have some strategic or stabilizing value. They built a studio to produce that image. The existence of Mount Weather was not publicly acknowledged until 1975, when a passenger aircraft struck the mountain during an approach to Dulles Airport. The crash drew attention to the site, and subsequent press investigations revealed its general purpose, though the full details of its capabilities remained classified for many years afterward. The incident illustrates something important about the culture of Cold War secrecy. The facilities were hidden not just from adversaries but from the American public. The people who lived in the shadow of these mountains, who drove past the unmarked perimeters and noticed the unusual security, were not supposed to know what was inside. In a democracy, this required a sustained and deliberate effort at concealment, one that was maintained for decades with remarkable consistency. The story of Cheyenne Mountain is, in one sense, the most familiar of all Cold War underground stories, and in another sense, one of the least understood. The mountain, located near Colorado Springs, was hollowed out beginning in 1961 to house the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, and its associated facilities. The scale of the excavation was extraordinary. Approximately 700,000 tons of rock were removed to create the caverns that house the complex. The main buildings inside the mountain are constructed on over 1,000 enormous steel springs, each capable of compressing several inches, designed to allow the structures to ride out the ground shock of nearby nuclear detonations. The complex contains multiple buildings connected by corridors, all suspended within a mountain designed to absorb what the planners politely called dynamic loading. What Cheyenne Mountain was designed to do was to provide continuous surveillance of North American airspace and, later, of missile launches from anywhere on Earth. The facility aggregated data from radar networks, satellite sensors, and intelligence feeds, and it was the place where the decision would be made or the recommendation would be offered that the United States was under attack. That decision, or recommendation, would then be passed to higher authority, and from there to the systems designed to respond. The chain was supposed to involve human judgment at each link, but the time constraints imposed by ballistic missile flight times, roughly 25 to 30 minutes from Soviet launch to American impact, meant that the human judgment available was, in practice, severely compressed. There was time for a phone call. There was time for a brief verification attempt. There was not time for deliberation in any meaningful sense. This compression of decision time was understood and accepted by the planners who built these systems. It was not a design flaw, it was a design feature, because the alternative, allowing more time for deliberation, meant allowing more time for the adversary to destroy your retaliatory capability before you could use it. The logic of nuclear deterrence required that response be rapid. Rapid response required that decision authority be pre-delegated, pre-positioned, and to a significant degree pre-committed. The underground systems were not just physical structures. They were the hardware of a decision architecture that had been deliberately constructed to minimize the role of human hesitation. In October of 1960, the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System radar at Thule Air Base in Greenland detected what its operators interpreted as a massive Soviet missile launch. The warning was passed upward through the chain. NORAD was alerted. The duty officer at Cheyenne Mountain, which had not yet been completed, was briefed. The alert level rose. Then someone noticed that the Soviet Premier, Nikita Khrushchev, was at that moment visiting New York. The calculation was made that it was unlikely the Soviets would launch a nuclear attack while their leader was in the United States. The warning was reconsidered. It turned out that the radar had detected the moon rising over Norway. The Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, which had cost hundreds of millions of dollars and had been built as the primary technical safeguard against surprise attack, had, on one of its first operational nights, mistaken the moon for an incoming missile barrage. The system was adjusted, but the incident established a pattern that would recur throughout the Cold War with disturbing regularity, a pattern in which the technical systems built to prevent catastrophe created, through their own failures and limitations, conditions under which catastrophe was very nearly precipitated. The Soviet approach to underground defense was, in many respects, parallel to the American one, and in some respects more extreme. The Soviet leadership had a cultural memory of invasion and devastation that the American leadership simply did not share. Russia had been invaded and partially destroyed within living memory. The instinct to build deep was not just a strategic calculation. It was a civilizational reflex. The Moscow Metro, completed in its initial sections in the 1930s, was designed from the beginning with military applications in mind. Its stations were built deep, far deeper than engineering requirements alone would have demanded, because deep stations could serve as bomb shelters. The metro system, as it expanded, became a subterranean civil defense infrastructure woven into the fabric of the city. But the Moscow Metro was only the beginning. Beneath the metro, beneath the city itself, the Soviet government constructed an entirely separate underground network that Western intelligence agencies spent decades trying to map and characterize. This network, referred to in various intelligence assessments by different designations and known in some accounts as Metro 2 or simply as the D6 line, was a deep underground railway system connecting the Kremlin, the Ministry of Defense, the FSB headquarters at Lubyanka, and several other critical government and military facilities to protected command centers outside the city. The depth of the Metro 2 tunnels, reportedly between 50 and 200 meters below the surface, placed them well beyond the immediate kill radius of most nuclear weapons. They were not intended to be invulnerable. They were intended to be survivable. The Soviet government never officially acknowledged the existence of Metro 2. Russian authorities have generally declined to confirm or deny it. The evidence for its existence comes from defector accounts, from the testimony of construction workers who participated in building portions of it, from satellite imagery analysis, and from the occasional anomaly in the public metro system that suggests infrastructure connecting to something that is not on any public map. The facility, if it exists as described, represents one of the most ambitious underground construction projects in human history. A shadow city beneath a city, built for a contingency that its builders hoped would never arrive and prepared for, as though it were inevitable. The American program most directly analogous to the Soviet deep underground network was the effort to create a hardened and redundant national command authority system, a set of facilities and communications links that would allow the president and the military chain of command to function after a nuclear attack. The facilities already described, Raven Rock, Mount Weather, and the others, were part of this system. But there was a recognition, even in the early planning stages, that fixed facilities, no matter how deeply buried, were potentially vulnerable. A fixed facility could be targeted precisely because it was fixed. Its location could be determined, its coordinates entered into a targeting solution, and sufficient warheads allocated to destroy it. The answer to this problem, at least in part, was mobility. The Airborne Command Post program, known in various iterations as Looking Glass and eventually as the E-6B Mercury aircraft in later years, was one response to this problem. The idea was to keep an airborne command center aloft at all times, manned by a general officer with the authority to direct nuclear forces, carrying the communications equipment necessary to reach submarines, land-based missiles, and bombers. If every ground-based facility were destroyed, the airborne command post would remain. Looking Glass aircraft maintained continuous airborne alert from February 1961 until July 1990. For nearly 30 years, there was not a single day when a strategic command aircraft was not in the air over the United States. The pilots and crews flew 8-hour shifts. The general officers rotated through. The aircraft were refueled in flight. The mission continued regardless of weather, regardless of political developments, regardless of anything except a direct order to stand down. And that order never came. The E-4B National Airborne Operations Center, known informally as the Doomsday Plane, was a more capable successor to earlier Airborne Command Post aircraft. Based on the Boeing 747 airframe, the E-4B is equipped with systems for communicating with nuclear forces across all media, including extremely low-frequency radio, which can penetrate seawater to reach submerged submarines. It carries a trailing wire antenna several miles long, deployed during flight, capable of transmitting the launch orders that submarines require to fire their missiles. The aircraft is hardened against electromagnetic pulse effects, air refuelable, and capable of sustaining operations for extended periods. 4 of them were built. They have maintained continuous alert posture since their introduction. They represent, in physical form, the institutional conviction that command and control of nuclear forces must survive any conceivable attack, and that the most reliable way to ensure survival is to keep the command authority moving. The submarine leg of the American nuclear triad occupied a particular place in Cold War strategic planning because it was the most survivable component. Ballistic missile submarines operated in waters vast enough and deep enough that locating them was, for most of the Cold War, essentially impossible. They were, in effect, mobile underground defense systems, platforms that moved through an environment that provided natural concealment and protection, comparable to, and in some respects superior to, anything that could be built in rock. The submarines carried ballistic missiles that could strike targets throughout the Soviet Union from virtually any ocean on Earth. They were, in the strategic lexicon, the assured destruction guarantee, the component of the triad that ensured that even if everything else were destroyed, enough remained to devastate the adversary. But submarines presented a command and control problem that was never fully resolved. A submarine at depth cannot receive normal radio transmissions. The physics of seawater make high-frequency radio propagation impossible below a certain depth. The solution was extremely low-frequency radio, LF, which could penetrate seawater but could carry only a tiny amount of information. An ALF transmission capable of reaching a submarine at depth might convey only a few characters of text per minute. This meant that the launch order, the message that would authorize a submarine to fire its missiles, had to be extremely short and extremely simple. It had to be something that could be transmitted through a medium that barely qualified as a communications channel. The system worked in the sense that it functioned as designed, but it worked by reducing the authorization to fire nuclear weapons to something not much more complex than a single code, transmitted through a medium so bandwidth limited that error checking was essentially impossible. The naval radio station at Cutler, Maine, operated the most powerful LF transmitter in the United States Navy's inventory for many years. The station's antenna system was enormous. 2 crossed baselines, each several miles long, designed to generate the extremely low-frequency signals that could reach submarines at operational depth. The station was hardened against certain effects of nuclear detonations, though not against a direct strike. Its role in the nuclear command and control architecture was not incidental. It was, for certain periods and in certain conditions, the primary means by which the National Command Authority could reach the submarine force. A station that very few Americans had ever heard of, located in a coastal Maine forest, was a critical node in the system designed to end civilization. The Deep Underground Command Center, abbreviated as DUCC, was a proposed American facility that was studied extensively in the 1960s and never built. The concept was to construct a command facility so deep, on the order of 3,000 feet below the surface of Washington, that it would be essentially invulnerable to any nuclear weapon that could be delivered by the Soviet arsenal. Studies conducted at various points during the 1960s concluded that such a facility was technically feasible, though extraordinarily expensive. The estimated cost ran into the billions of dollars, which was extraordinary for the period. The facility would have required a new tunneling technology, a new approach to underground ventilation and life support at extreme depths, and a new set of communication solutions for reaching surface and airborne systems from so far below ground. The project was studied, analyzed, and ultimately not pursued, not because it was technically impossible, but because the cost and the complexity could not be justified relative to the protection that could be obtained through mobile systems. The submarines were cheaper and more survivable. The airborne command posts provided comparable continuity at a fraction of the expense. The mountain and the pneumatic springs would have to be sufficient for the fixed facilities. The Soviet answer to the command and control survival problem was, in some respects, more extreme than anything the Americans built or seriously contemplated. The system known as perimeter, and referred to by some American analysts as the dead hand, was a semi-automatic command and control system designed to ensure that a Soviet nuclear response would occur even if the entire human chain of command had been destroyed. The system used a network of sensors to detect the seismic signatures, radiation levels, and other indicators of nuclear strikes on Soviet territory. If the sensors detected conditions consistent with a large-scale nuclear attack, and if communications with the normal command authority had been severed, the perimeter system could automatically transmit launch orders to Soviet strategic nuclear forces through dedicated command rockets that overflew the missile fields. The system was not fully automatic. There was supposed to be a human being at some point in the chain who could activate it, but the activation threshold was designed to be minimal, and the subsequent process, once initiated, was effectively autonomous. Perimeter was operational by 1985. Its existence was not acknowledged by Soviet or Russian authorities until 1993, when a former Soviet colonel named Valery Yarenich described it to an American journalist. The revelation was extraordinary, not because it was technically implausible. American strategic planners had long suspected that something like it existed, but because of what it represented philosophically. Perimeter was a machine built to make the decision to launch nuclear weapons in the event that human beings were unable to make it. It was not a doomsday machine in the Hollywood sense. It required human initiation under certain conditions. But the conditions under which it was designed to operate were precisely those conditions in which human judgment was most likely to be impaired, most likely to be panicked, and most likely to err in catastrophic directions. The Soviets built a system to remove human error from the nuclear launch process by removing humans from it. The Kapustin Yar facility, located in the Astrakhan region of Russia, was one of the Soviet Union's primary missile test ranges and one of the most extensively developed underground military complexes in the country. The facility was used from the late 1940s onward for the testing of ballistic missiles and was the site of the Soviet Union's first successful ballistic missile test in 1947. Over the following decades, it was expanded to include not just surface testing infrastructure, but extensive underground bunkers, storage facilities for missiles and warheads, and hardened command structures capable of surviving blast overpressures that would destroy conventional construction. Western intelligence agencies devoted substantial resources to monitoring Kapustin Yar throughout the Cold War, and the intelligence picture that emerged, pieced together from aerial reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and occasional defector accounts, suggested a facility of considerable depth and complexity, whose full dimensions remained uncertain even after the Cold War ended. The American missile fields of the Great Plains represented a different kind of underground architecture, distributed rather than concentrated, spread across hundreds of square miles, rather than built into a single mountain. The Minuteman missile system, deployed beginning in the early 1960s, consisted of hardened silos buried in the earth of Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, and Missouri. Each silo was a roughly cylindrical structure extending perhaps 80 feet below the surface, capped with a thick concrete and steel door designed to withstand the blast effects of nearby nuclear detonations. The missiles inside were connected to launch control facilities, small, hardened capsules buried some distance away, manned by 2 officers who had the physical and procedural authority to launch their assigned missiles. The launch control facilities were suspended on shock-absorbing systems similar to those used in Cheyenne Mountain, designed to remain operational even if the missiles in their field were destroyed. The logic of the Minuteman basing mode was that concentration was vulnerability. Placing all your strategic weapons in one location meant that one sufficiently large attack could eliminate them all. Spreading them across hundreds of locations in hardened silos meant that destroying them all required a proportionately large and expensive attack, one that might consume a substantial fraction of the adversary's own strategic arsenal in the attempt. The Minuteman fields were not primarily designed to survive a nuclear war. They were designed to make attacking them costly enough that the adversary would think twice. The hardened silos were a deterrent argument expressed in concrete and steel, buried in the American heartland, beneath the wheat fields and the snow. The 2-man rule that governed Minuteman launch authority was one of the most consequential design decisions in the history of nuclear weapons. No single individual could launch a missile. It required 2 officers acting simultaneously, each turning a key at a console designed so that the 2 key switches were physically too far apart for one person to reach both at once. The procedures required that both officers make independent judgments, check independent authentication codes, and execute their portions of the launch sequence within a specified time window. The system was designed to prevent unauthorized launch by a single individual, whether through coercion, psychological breakdown, or ideological conviction. What the system was not designed to handle, and what the planners acknowledged as a residual vulnerability, was the case in which both officers in a capsule independently made the same judgment that a launch was authorized when it was not. This was considered unlikely because the procedures required confirmation from higher authority and because the 2 officers could be expected to check each other's interpretation of ambiguous information. But the Cold War produced enough cases of false warning, enough episodes in which the technical systems reported conditions that did not exist, that the question of what 2 officers would do when presented with an unambiguous seeming alert that happened to be wrong was not purely theoretical. It was a question that the system's designers had addressed with procedures and training, and the hope that the procedures and training would be sufficient. They were sufficient, but they were tested more often than most people know. In November of 1979, a technician at NORAD headquarters inadvertently loaded a training tape into the operational warning system. The tape simulated a massive Soviet nuclear strike. The displays in the NORAD command center lit up with hundreds of incoming missiles. The duty officer, seeing what appeared to be a full-scale nuclear attack, initiated the alert procedures. Interceptor aircraft were scrambled. The National Military Command Center in the Pentagon was notified. The airborne command post was put on alert. The sequence continued for approximately 6 minutes before someone determined that the attack displays were inconsistent with the satellite data. The satellites showed no launches. The training tape had simulated a launch scenario for which there were no corresponding satellite observations because the satellites had not been part of the training simulation. The inconsistency was the tell. 6 minutes of procedural escalation, of military aircraft entering the air, of command systems activating across the eastern United States, before someone noticed that the satellites showed nothing. Less than a year later, in June of 1980, a faulty computer chip, a chip that cost 46 cents, caused the NORAD warning systems to indicate intermittently that Soviet submarine-launched missiles were inbound. The displays flickered. They showed 2 missiles, then 200, then 2 again. The inconsistency was apparent almost immediately, and the alert was terminated before it progressed as far as the November 1979 incident. But for a brief period, the command systems that controlled American nuclear forces were responding to attack indications generated by a malfunctioning component worth less than $1. The engineers found the chip. They replaced it. They reviewed the procedures. The system continued. The Soviet side experienced its own false alarm of comparable or greater severity in September of 1983. A Soviet early warning satellite system called OKO detected what its software interpreted as 5 Minuteman missiles launched from the United States. The duty officer at the Soviet Missile Early Warning Facility near Moscow, a lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov, was responsible for reporting the alert to his superiors, who would then begin the chain of decisions that led ultimately to a possible retaliatory launch. Petrov did not report the launch. He judged, based on his assessment of the satellite data and his knowledge of the system, that the alert was likely a false alarm. His reasoning was partly technical. The satellites were known to have issues with sunlight reflections from clouds that could generate false positives, and partly intuitive. He reasoned that if the Americans were actually launching a nuclear strike, they would not launch 5 missiles. They would launch many more. 5 missiles made no strategic sense. He called it a false alarm and waited. Petrov was correct. The satellite had detected sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds above a Minuteman launch site in North Dakota. There were no missiles. The system had failed in a way that its designers had not fully anticipated. Petrov's decision to call it a false alarm rather than escalate was not authorized by his procedures. His procedures told him to report the warning. He did not report it because he thought his procedures were wrong in this case. He was an individual making an unauthorized decision in a system that had been deliberately designed to minimize the role of individual discretion, and his unauthorized deviation from procedure may have been one of the significant factors that prevented a nuclear war in the late 20th century. He was reprimanded for his deviation from procedure. He was not decorated. He retired on a modest pension and lived in a small town outside Moscow. The Yamantau mountain facility in the southern Ural Mountains of Russia became a subject of significant concern for American intelligence analysts and policymakers in the 1990s. Satellite imagery showed that construction activity at the site had been continuous and extensive throughout the late Soviet period and had continued after the Soviet Union's collapse. The facility appeared to be a massive underground complex, excavated deep into the Ural Mountains, with enough excavated volume to shelter tens of thousands of people. The American government repeatedly asked the Russian government what the facility was for. The Russians provided varying answers at different times: a mining complex, a food storage facility, a government relocation site. None of the answers were consistent, and none explained the scale of the activity. Congressional investigations in the mid-1990s flagged Yamantau as a potential violation of the spirit of post-Cold War arms control agreements. since it appeared to represent continued heavy investment in nuclear war survival infrastructure at a time when both governments were publicly committed to reducing the salience of nuclear weapons. The Yamantau situation illustrated a fundamental problem with Cold War arms control and its aftermath. The underground systems that the superpowers had built were not dismantled when the Cold War ended. They were maintained, staffed, and in some cases expanded. The logic that had driven their construction, the logic of worst-case planning, of assuming that the adversary might at any moment be preparing for war, did not evaporate simply because the political context changed. The institutions responsible for the systems had been organized around the mission of maintaining them. They continued to maintain them. The systems persisted. Returning to the American side of the ledger, the Strategic Air Command headquarters at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska was one of the most consequential command facilities of the Cold War era, and its underground components were among the most sophisticated. SAC was the organization responsible for the planning and execution of American strategic nuclear operations, and its underground command post, a hardened structure that could be sealed against blast and radiation effects, was the nerve center through which nuclear strike plans would be coordinated and directed. The facility contained the war planning computers, the communication systems, and the operational staffs that would, in the event of nuclear war, attempt to manage the chaos of a civilization-ending exchange. The people who worked inside it spent their careers preparing for an event that they were simultaneously working to prevent. The tension between preparation and prevention was a persistent feature of Cold War defense planning, and it expressed itself most acutely in the underground systems. The systems were built to survive a war. Their existence was part of the argument that deterrence worked, that the adversary, knowing that American command and control could survive a nuclear strike and direct a retaliatory response, would calculate that there was nothing to be gained by attacking first. The survival of the underground systems was therefore a necessary condition of deterrence. But the systems also embodied and institutionalized the assumption that war was possible, perhaps even likely, and in so doing they contributed to the conditions that made war more thinkable and more procedurally accessible than it might otherwise have been. The Giayuk Gap, the maritime choke point between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom, was one of the most strategically important geographical features of the Cold War, and the effort to monitor and control it required a network of underwater surveillance systems that represented a different kind of underground defense architecture. The sound surveillance system, known as SOSUS, was an array of hydrophone sensors laid on the ocean floor across the North Atlantic, designed to detect and track Soviet submarines as they passed from Arctic waters into the broader Atlantic. SOSUS was the largest and most sensitive underwater listening system ever built, and for much of the Cold War, it gave American and NATO forces a significant advantage in anti-submarine warfare. The system's existence was classified until 1991. Its detailed capabilities remain partially classified today. SOSUS was not a single installation, but a network of installations connected by undersea cables to shore-based processing facilities, where the hydrophone data was analyzed by teams of specialists. The processing facilities, located at various points along the eastern seaboard of North America and in Europe, were themselves hardened structures, designed to continue operating under various threat conditions. The data they processed was enormously valuable strategically, because it told NATO planners where the Soviet submarine force was at any given time. In a nuclear war scenario, that knowledge would have been critical for targeting Soviet submarines before they could launch their missiles. In peacetime, it was a continuous reminder that Soviet submarines were out there, moving, and that the underwater dimension of the nuclear balance was as important as anything that could be seen on the surface or tracked through the air. The British contribution to Cold War underground defense architecture was concentrated in a series of regional seats of government, facilities built throughout the United Kingdom to allow government functions to continue if London were destroyed. The most significant of these was the facility at Corsham in Wiltshire, known at various times as Burlington and later as Turnstile. Constructed in a former limestone quarry, the Corsham facility was designed to house the British government in exile, so to speak, the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, and the key personnel necessary to maintain nuclear command authority and civilian government functions. The facility contained miles of tunnels, thousands of rooms, its own telephone exchange, its own BBC broadcasting studio, cafeterias, dormitories, and all the infrastructure of a small underground city. What the Corsham facility was not designed to do was to shelter the general public. It was designed to shelter the government. The people of Bristol and Bath and the surrounding towns, hundreds of thousands of them, were expected to manage as best they could on the surface. This was a universal feature of Cold War civil defense planning in the Western democracies. The survival infrastructure was built for institutions, not for populations. The bunkers and the tunnels and the hardened command centers were designed to preserve the capacity to govern, to wage war, and to command nuclear forces. They were not designed to protect the people who would be governed, who would be conscripted to wage that war, or who would live in the zones where nuclear weapons fell. The democratic governments of the West built survival infrastructure for themselves and called it civil defense. This was not a secret that the governments went out of their way to publicize, but it was not really a secret at all. Anyone who examined the actual civil defense planning of the period could see clearly that the hardened facilities were for officials and that the public was expected, in official plans, to shelter in place, to remain calm, and to follow instructions. The instructions were sometimes specific and sometimes bewilderingly vague. In the United States, the Federal Civil Defense Administration published guidance that advised families to dig backyard shelters, to stockpile food and water, and to listen for official broadcasts. The guidance did not explain what they would do when the food and water ran out, or when the shelter collapsed, or when the radiation levels outside made it impossible to emerge. The guidance assumed that surviving the initial blast was the challenge, and that surviving the aftermath was a problem that could be solved by organization and community effort. The actual physics of nuclear weapons suggested a different picture. The hardened facilities for government survival were therefore not just engineering projects. They were political statements, assertions that the machinery of the state was worth preserving at whatever cost, that the continuity of command authority was more important than the continuity of the population that authority nominally served. The people who built them did not articulate it in those terms. They articulated it in terms of deterrence and recovery planning and the preservation of constitutional governance. But the facilities themselves, with their ministerial apartments and their government offices, and their total absence of capacity for the surrounding civilian population, told a story that the official language did not. The Pine Gap facility in Australia, located near Alice Springs in the Northern Territory, was one of the most significant intelligence-gathering installations of the Cold War and one of the most extensively hardened. Officially described as a joint defense space research facility, Pine Gap was, in fact, a primary site for the processing of data from American reconnaissance satellites, including intelligence satellites that monitored Soviet missile tests, tracked military movements, and performed functions that the two governments were not prepared to publicly acknowledge. The facility's underground components, hardened communications infrastructure, protected computing systems, and survivable operations centers reflected its critical role in the intelligence architecture that supported American strategic planning. Pine Gap's location in the Australian interior was not coincidental. It was selected in part because its geographical position gave American satellite systems in certain orbits an optimal ground station location for data downlink, and in part because its remoteness from populated areas and from the primary targets of Soviet strategic planning gave it a degree of natural protection. The Soviet strategic planners certainly knew Pine Gap existed and understood its function. It appeared on their targeting lists. The Australian government's decision to host the facility, made against the backdrop of significant domestic political controversy, was a decision to accept that its territory was a nuclear target in exchange for the intelligence benefits and the alliance commitment that the facility represented. The Australian public debate about Pine Gap was unusual among Cold War controversies because it made visible something that most Cold War defense arrangements kept carefully invisible: the fact that hosting American military infrastructure meant accepting a share of the nuclear targeting that came with it. Towns near American bomber bases in England and Germany understood this in a general way. The communities near ICBM silos in the American Midwest lived with it. Pine Gap brought the issue to the surface in a way that produced genuine political tension, and the discussion it prompted about what sovereignty meant in the context of a nuclear alliance was more honest and more searching than most governments were prepared to engage in. The Soviet submarine base at Pavlovskoye in the Russian Far East was one of a network of heavily fortified naval installations constructed along the Pacific coast to support the Soviet Pacific Fleet's submarine force. The installation included underground submarine pens, tunnels cut into the hillside that allowed submarines to be berthed, serviced, and prepared for patrol inside hardened facilities that protected them from air and missile attack. The submarine pen design was a Soviet engineering specialty developed over decades, an opening cut into a cliff face at or below sea level, large enough to admit a submarine, leading to an interior space hardened against blast and capable of functioning even if the approaches were under attack. Similar facilities existed in the Kola Peninsula in northwestern Russia, supporting submarines operating in the North Atlantic. The Kola facilities were of particular concern to NATO because of their proximity to Norway and their relationship to the Soviet Northern Fleet, which maintained the most capable and most numerous submarine force in the Soviet inventory. Intelligence assessments of Kola indicated a network of hardened pens, storage facilities for torpedoes and missiles, command structures, and support infrastructure of a depth and complexity that suggested the Soviets intended to maintain submarine operations even in the context of a full-scale conventional war. The facilities were heavily targeted in NATO nuclear war plans, which meant that any scenario in which NATO used nuclear weapons in Europe would almost certainly include strikes on the Kola Peninsula, strikes that, given the proximity of the facilities to Norwegian territory, would have produced radiological effects extending across Scandinavia. The Greenbrier Resort in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, was, for most of its history, known as one of the most elegant resort hotels in the eastern United States. Presidents had vacationed there. The social elite had gathered there for generations. What was not known to the guests, and to most of the staff, was that beneath the resort's west wing, there was a hardened government relocation facility designed to house the entire United States Congress in the event of a nuclear attack. The facility was built between 1958 and 1961, in a construction project concealed behind the cover story of building a new hotel exhibition hall. It contained dormitories for all members of Congress, a cafeteria, a medical center, a decontamination facility, and a communication system connected to the National Emergency Network. It was stocked with supplies, staffed by a rotating group of maintenance personnel who operated under the cover story of being regular hotel employees and kept in continuous readiness for deployment. The existence of the Greenbrier facility was maintained as a secret for over 30 years. It was revealed in 1992 by the Washington Post following the end of the Cold War. The revelation prompted the government to close the facility, since a facility whose location has been publicly revealed no longer serves its purpose. The staff members who had maintained it for 3 decades, who had changed its linens and tested its equipment and replenished its supplies without telling their families what they were actually doing, received various forms of recognition, though their work had consisted largely of maintaining a secret that their employers had decided to abandon. The continuity of government planning that produced the Greenbrier facility and its counterparts also drove the creation of a network of underground communications relays and hardened switching facilities across the United States. The telephone system of the mid-20th century was, by design, a relatively fragile network. It relied on above-ground cables, centralized switching facilities in large urban areas, and physical infrastructure concentrated in precisely the locations most likely to be targeted in a nuclear exchange. Making national command authority survivable, required making communications survivable, which meant burying the critical communications nodes, hardening the switching facilities, and creating redundant paths for information to travel between the points that mattered. AT&T, at the direction of the federal government, constructed a network of hardened underground long lines facilities during the 1950s and 1960s. These facilities, windowless, reinforced concrete structures, often built at elevation or buried in hillsides, served as the relay points for long-distance telephone communications. They were hardened against blast and equipped with backup power, and they were staffed continuously. The network extended across the country, with facilities spaced at intervals compatible with the transmission technology of the period. The existence of the hardened long lines network was not classified in the same way that purely military facilities were classified, but its purpose was not advertised. The employees of AT&T who worked in the facilities were not specifically told that their workplace was a node in the Nuclear Command Authority communications system, though the nature of the facilities, the blast doors, the emergency power, the unusual security measures, made the general nature of the enterprise fairly apparent to anyone paying attention. The Navy's Strategic Communications Wing at Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma was responsible for another element of the Nuclear Command Authority communications architecture. The wing operated aircraft equipped with the extremely low-frequency trailing wire antennas necessary to reach submerged submarines, and its mission in the nuclear war planning was to ensure that launch authority could be transmitted to the submarine fleet, even in a severely degraded communications environment. The aircraft were kept on alert. The crews were trained to fly specific mission profiles in the event of an emergency. The mission required maintaining an airborne relay that could bridge the gap between the National Command Authority, wherever it happened to be at the time, and the submarines that constituted the most survivable component of the nuclear triad. The development of hardened missile silos in the Soviet Union followed a path broadly parallel to the American experience, but with differences in timing, in the specific technical solutions adopted, and in the deployment context. Soviet ICBM silos were generally constructed with a preference for greater hardness, the ability to withstand higher blast overpressures than comparable American designs, reflecting the Soviet assessment of the likely accuracy of American warheads and the targeting solutions that American planners would use. Soviet silos were also generally deployed in larger fields, with missiles more densely packed, a deployment pattern that reflected different assumptions about the relationship between field geometry and survivability. The missile fields associated with the Soviet Strategic Rocket Forces, the service branch responsible for land-based nuclear missiles, extended across vast areas of the Soviet Union, from the European USSR east into Siberia and the Soviet Far East. The fields were served by their own transportation infrastructure, their own communications networks, their own security forces, and their own logistical chains. They were, in effect, small underground cities distributed across one of the largest land masses on Earth, each city containing several officers whose professional purpose was to launch nuclear weapons if ordered to do so, and whose personal purpose was presumably something more than that, something that the institutional context in which they worked made difficult to express or sustain. The Defense Communications System, the American military communications network that connected command authorities to nuclear forces and to each other, was hardened at multiple nodes throughout the Cold War period. The system evolved over the decades as technology changed and as vulnerabilities were identified and addressed, but its core function remained constant. It was the nervous system of the American nuclear war-fighting apparatus, the medium through which orders and information would flow in a scenario that the system's designers hoped would never materialize. The hardening measures applied to the system's nodes, buried cables, protected switching facilities, backup systems designed to take over when primary systems failed, represented a sustained engineering effort to solve the problem that the system's designers called survivability, and that might more accurately be called the problem of giving instructions at the end of the world. The Auto-VON network, the automatic voice network, was the primary voice communication system for the American military during the Cold War period. It connected military installations across the country and linked them to overseas commands, and it was designed with a degree of redundancy and hardening, intended to maintain voice communications in the event of nuclear attack. Autovon was eventually succeeded by more modern systems, but during its operational life, it served as the voice backbone of the military command structure, carrying the phone calls that moved information between the points where decisions were made and the points where the consequences of those decisions would be felt. The tunnels beneath Washington, beyond the government survival facilities already described, included a network of utility and transit infrastructure that acquired national security significance in the Cold War context. The Washington Metro, begun in the late 1960s, was designed with deeper stations than would have been strictly necessary for transit purposes. The design reflected an awareness, probably more ambient than explicit, that the transit infrastructure would also serve as shelter infrastructure in the event of attack. The stations of the Red Line through downtown Washington, some of which extend more than 100 feet below the surface, would have provided limited protection against the effects of nuclear detonations at moderate distances. Whether anyone would have been able to reach them in the time available between a warning and a strike, a time measured in minutes, if warning were available at all, was a question that the planners apparently did not regard as requiring a definitive answer. The alternate military command center at Raven Rock, described earlier, was one node in a set of fixed alternate command facilities. Another was the National Emergency Command Post, at a location that was not publicly identified for many years. The concept of the alternate command post reflected the recognition that a single fixed location, however hardened, was still a single point of failure. If the adversary's targeting was precise enough and his available warheads sufficient, any fixed facility could be destroyed. The solution was redundancy. Multiple facilities, each capable of assuming command authority, distributed across locations that could not all be attacked simultaneously without consuming a disproportionate fraction of the attacking force's capacity. The logic of redundancy extended to the communication systems as well. If the primary communications network were destroyed, there had to be a backup. If the backup were destroyed, there had to be a backup to the backup. The process of extending redundancy through multiple layers of backup systems created a system of systems that was, in theory, increasingly robust against attack. In practice, it created a system of systems that was increasingly complex, increasingly difficult to manage, and increasingly likely to generate the kinds of anomalous conditions, false alarms, ambiguous data, conflicting reports, that had produced the near-miss events already described. The passive detection system, a network of seismic sensors deployed at various locations around the world to detect nuclear tests, was ostensibly a monitoring system for arms control verification. In practice, it was also a component of the strategic intelligence architecture, because seismic detection of nuclear detonations provided information about the yields and the locations of enemy tests that had direct implications for targeting and force planning. The system was run, in the American case, by a combination of military and civilian organizations, with data flowing to processing centers where specialists tried to distinguish nuclear tests from earthquakes and from mine blasts and from the various other seismic events that the Earth generates continuously. The Colorado Springs region, home to Cheyenne Mountain and NORAD, also hosted the U.S. Space Command facilities and the command infrastructure for the satellite systems that provided early warning of missile launches. The concentration of strategic command infrastructure in a single geographical area was itself a planning consideration. The density of critical facilities in the Colorado Springs area meant that it was a major target, and the hardening measures applied to Cheyenne Mountain were partly driven by the recognition that any nuclear war would include attempts to neutralize the command and control infrastructure concentrated there. The mountain was designed to survive those attempts. Whether it could have survived the specific attack packages that Soviet planners would have allocated to it is a question that was never tested, and that the documentation available suggests was a matter of genuine uncertainty even among the people responsible for the facility's design. The emergency rocket communications system was one of the more straightforward applications of Cold War engineering to the command and control survival problem. The system consisted of a set of modified ballistic missiles that, instead of carrying nuclear warheads, carried radio transmitters. If the normal communications networks were destroyed, these rockets could be launched and would broadcast launch authorization messages over a wide area, reaching missile silos and submarines that might not be accessible by any other means. The rockets would fly their trajectories, parabolic paths that took them to high altitude over the United States, broadcasting continuously as they fell. The system was a backup to the backups, an additional layer of redundancy in a command and control architecture that was built on the assumption that every layer below it might fail. The intellectual framework that governed Cold War strategic planning was built on a series of assumptions that were individually plausible and collectively terrifying. The assumptions included that the adversary was rational, that rational actors would not initiate a nuclear exchange because the costs were prohibitive, that deterrence therefore worked, and that the purpose of the underground systems was to ensure that deterrence remained credible by ensuring that retaliation remained possible. The framework was internally consistent. The problem was that the Cold War repeatedly generated situations in which the assumptions did not hold, situations in which the adversary's rationality could not be assumed, in which the costs of action were unclear, and in which the automated and pre-delegated systems were making decisions faster than the human decision-makers they were nominally supporting. The Able Archer exercise in November of 1983 was perhaps the closest the Cold War came to accidental nuclear war, and it came closest precisely because of the underground systems and the protocols that governed them. Able Archer was a NATO command exercise designed to practice the procedures for transitioning from conventional to nuclear war. It was a realistic exercise involving realistic communications, realistic message formats, and realistic movement of personnel and equipment. The Soviet intelligence services, watching the exercise through their collection systems, could not be certain that it was an exercise rather than the preparatory phase of an actual nuclear attack. The Soviet General Staff went to an unusually high state of alert. Nuclear-capable aircraft in Eastern Europe were brought to readiness. The indicators that reached American intelligence suggested that the Soviet military was preparing to launch a preemptive strike under the misapprehension that NATO was about to attack. The crisis passed. The exercise ended. The Soviet military stood down. But the episode was serious enough that the American intelligence community produced a classified assessment concluding that the Soviets had genuinely believed, at least for a period, that they were facing an imminent nuclear strike. The assessment reached the Reagan administration and contributed to a reassessment of the rhetoric and posture that had characterized American policy in the early 1980s. The underground systems had been tested, not by a real attack, but by the perception of a possible attack, and they had very nearly generated a response to something that wasn't there. The issue of nuclear weapons command and control in the context of a decapitating strike, an attack designed to eliminate the national command authority before it could authorize a response, was one that both superpowers grappled with throughout the Cold War and never fully resolved. The American approach was to pre-delegate authority, to create redundant command nodes, and to maintain airborne and submarine-based command capabilities that could survive even if Washington were destroyed in the opening minutes of a war. The Soviet approach included perimeter and its associated systems, the deep underground facilities in Moscow and elsewhere, and a command authority structure designed to survive in hardened facilities while the conflict above continued. Neither approach fully resolved the fundamental tension between the desire to maintain meaningful human control over nuclear weapons and the operational requirement that response be sufficiently rapid to be credible. The more survivable a command system was, the more distributed its authority had to be, and the more distributed the authority, the less certain it was that the humans exercising it were making decisions with full information and clear judgment. The underground systems solved the physical problem of survival. They did not solve the epistemological problem of knowing what was actually happening, and they did not solve the psychological problem of making sound judgments under conditions of extreme stress and radical uncertainty. The Soviet Kozvinsky Mountain facility in the Ural Mountains was believed by American intelligence to house one of the primary hardened command centers for the Russian strategic rocket forces. The facility was understood to be deeply buried inside the mountain, connected to the perimeter system, and capable of receiving and transmitting launch orders even in the aftermath of a nuclear exchange. American intelligence assessments of Kozvinsky Mountain were used in the 1990s as part of the argument for maintaining certain American warheads and targeting options that could threaten deeply buried facilities. The so-called hard and deeply buried target problem that drove American investment in Earth-penetrating warhead designs. The Earth-penetrating warhead development program reflected a recognition that the underground systems built during the Cold War had, in a certain sense, survived the Cold War. They were still there. They were still staffed. They were still in the assessment of American planners, potentially relevant to scenarios that the post-Cold War world had not entirely foreclosed. The investment in the capability to destroy deeply buried targets was an acknowledgement that the underground architecture of the Cold War was not a historical artifact, but an active element of the contemporary security environment. The NORAD facility inside Cheyenne Mountain went to a warm standby status in 2006, with its primary mission functions relocated to a less hardened facility at Peterson Air Force Base nearby. The official rationale was that the Cold War threat environment, the threat of a massive Soviet nuclear strike, had changed sufficiently that the extreme hardening measures represented by Cheyenne Mountain were no longer the appropriate response to the actual threat landscape. The facility was maintained in a condition that would allow it to resume full operations within a defined period. It was not decommissioned. It was not sealed. The springs remained under the buildings inside the mountain. The blast doors remained operable. The facility remained available for reactivation. The history of the underground defense systems of the Cold War is, among other things, a history of organizational persistence. The institutions built to manage these systems developed their own logics, their own interests, and their own momentum. They did not close when the threat they were designed to address diminished. They did not cease to exist when the political conditions that had justified their creation changed. They adapted, sometimes slowly and sometimes reluctantly, to altered circumstances. But they continued. The facilities remained. The staffs remained. The protocols remained. The command authority remained, distributed across the same network of mountains and tunnels and hardened capsules and airborne platforms that had been assembled over 40 years of Cold War preparation. The two-man rule and the permissive action links and the elaborate authentication procedures that governed nuclear weapons authorization were, throughout the Cold War, measures designed to prevent unauthorized use. What they could not prevent, and what they were not designed to prevent, was authorized use based on false information, use that was procedurally correct and substantively catastrophic. The technical systems that generated the false alarms at NORAD, the satellite system that nearly triggered a Soviet response in 1983, the computer chip that indicated a submarine launch that had not occurred, these were not failures of authorization procedure. They were failures of information. The procedures worked correctly. The information was wrong. The Cold War ended formally with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in December of 1991. The underground systems did not end with it. The Russian Federation inherited the Soviet strategic nuclear forces and the infrastructure that supported them, including the deeply buried command facilities, the submarine pens, the missile fields, and the perimeter system. The United States maintained its own infrastructure, mothballing some facilities, maintaining others, and continuing to staff the systems that had formed the backbone of its nuclear deterrent. The arms control agreements that followed the Cold War reduced the number of warheads and the number of delivery systems, but they did not eliminate the systems themselves, and they did not dismantle the organizational and technical infrastructure that had grown up around them over 40 years. The mountains remain mountains. The springs remain coiled beneath the buildings that rest on them. The submarines remain at sea. The command authority remains distributed across the same network of hardened and mobile platforms that the Cold War created. The procedures remain in effect. The two-man rule remains in effect. The authentication codes remain in effect. The satellites continue to monitor launch plumes. The hydrophones continue to listen to the underwater acoustic environment of the world's oceans. The legacy systems and the successor systems operate in parallel. The old hardware maintained alongside the new, because the institutional appetite for redundancy that built the Cold War underground architecture did not expire when the Cold War did. The 24 systems examined in this account represent a fraction of the full inventory, which remains only partially in the public domain. They were built by human beings who understood exactly what they were building and who built it anyway, because the alternative, not building it, seemed to them more dangerous. They were built under conditions of extreme secrecy, with enormous resources, by organizations that were simultaneously trying to prevent the event they were preparing for. They were tested, repeatedly and involuntarily, by failures and false alarms and near misses that demonstrated both the robustness of the systems and the fragility of the assumptions on which they rested. The Cold War ended without the underground systems being used for the purposes they were built. It did not end because the systems were dismantled, or because the logic that created them was abandoned, or because the organizations that maintained them concluded that they were no longer necessary. It ended because the Soviet Union ceased to exist as a political entity, leaving behind a country that inherited its weapons, its infrastructure, its command procedures, and its institutional memory of 40 years of nuclear standoff. The systems that had been built to survive a war survived the peace instead. They are still there,